hope to have greater engagement with the new refugee community and Afghan diasporic youth in order to cultivate a space to enhance skills, knowledge and networks. Going forward, this conference intends to bring together academics and professionals operating in various sectors to discuss their work, as well as provide advice for Afghans in the UK to aid them in navigating both educational settings and the UK workforce through shared cultural knowledge. So we highly recommend that you use today to share your personal experiences and engage in interactive dialogue with one another. We'd also just like to emphasize that the remarks shared today are those of the speakers, unless otherwise stated as official institutional endorsements. We would like to thank the Sussex Centre for Migration Research for their collaboration with us on this event. I would also like to thank Naimat Zafari, who will be speaking on today's first panel, who initially reached out to AISS to host this event. We hope that you find today's talks and discussions informative and insightful. Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping. The ladies' toilets closest to the door are not working, so you have to go out the end of the corridor to the right. There's no practice fire alarm scheduled for today, so if there is an alarm, it's a real alarm, so we all have to evacuate. We can't do it through this room, so we have to all go back through the back door. Yeah, that's the housekeeping. And now I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Lisa Schuster. Dr. Schuster is a reader in sociology, working on forced migration, and in particular forced return to Afghanistan. She has spent most of the past decade in Afghanistan, and together with Afghan colleagues, is writing up a recently completed project that examined the hopes, fears, and plans of Afghan families, the representation of migration in Afghan oral culture, and the development of migration policy in Afghanistan. She was also working in the Ministry for Refugees and Repatriation in Kabul when the government fell, and Dr. Schuster was evacuated on the 18th of August 2021.
Thank you very much. I was very honoured and humbled to be asked to speak to this group. My voice sounds very strange. Is it clear?
Yes, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. When asked to do this, as Rabia will confirm, I was hesitant because I knew that there were many Afghan scholars here in the UK who I felt would be better placed than I to address you. But after some reassurance from some of my colleagues in the room, I decided perhaps I could not necessarily give a formal keynote speech, but talk about some of the ways that your lives might be made easier as you study in the UK, seek employment in the UK, and perhaps talk a little bit about the competitive advantage that you Afghans have in some areas of research. But I want to start off by talking about my experience as an outsider in Afghanistan. I arrived in Afghanistan, I was there briefly in 2011, but started work on a project in 2012. I went to Afghanistan to look at the consequences of deportation for Afghans deported from Europe. I wanted to look at the impact that that deportation would have on those individuals and on their families and communities. I was a white, middle-aged, privileged woman who had minimal knowledge of Farsi, gained from contact with Afghans in Europe. I had very few networks, mostly again due to my links with Afghans in Europe. I knew next to nothing about Afghan history or culture, very little about the country. In spite of that, being a European, I managed to get access to funds that allowed me to conduct my project. As a result of my ignorance, I made a number of mistakes. One of the first was actually in that first short visit in 2011. I went to stay with the family of a young friend from France and brought as a gift a scarlet salwar kameez. And when I opened it and presented it to his sister, she was horrified. I had absolutely no idea that a scarlet dress had social implications that I was unaware of. But aside from that, the biggest problem that I faced was language. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with this challenge. It wasn't just that I didn't have the vocabulary, but not knowing the cultural context, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know the extent of my ignorance. I didn't have words to ask for the meaning of concepts that were unfamiliar to me, behaviors that were unfamiliar, structures and systems that were unfamiliar. As a result, I made lots of assumptions. I knew that there were different ethnicities in Afghanistan, but I didn't know about the relations between those groups. And in particular, I had no idea about the heterogeneity of each of those. That it was impossible to speak about Pashtun as a homogeneous group, or Hazara or Tajik as homogeneous groups. That within each of those groups, there were significant differences. I had certain assumptions about gender. Luckily, the very first family that I went to stay with and spent about 3 months with corrected some of my misconceptions. When I arrived, Khanum Gul, who was about my age, had broken her ankle, and her wonderful, lovely husband did all of the housework and the cooking and took care of her. That wasn't an image that I had of Afghan marriages. So what I'm saying is that arriving in Afghanistan, I was in a situation that was very unfamiliar, and it was very difficult. I was an outsider. In Afghanistan, you wouldn't have made the mistakes that I made, perhaps most particularly in relation to security. Another family that I went to stay with, for me, were behaving very strangely, asking me to spend a couple of hours in the kitchen, or deciding that suddenly we were all going to go to Mazar. What I hadn't understood was that people quite close to the family had realized they had a foreigner staying with them, and that represented an opportunity to gain some money by kidnapping. So they had moved me very quickly to Mazar. In my ignorance, I didn't understand the threat that I represented. You wouldn't have made those mistakes because you were insiders in Afghanistan. However, having been infected with Afghanistan for perpetuity, I couldn't leave. I stayed for a further 2 years, and I learned a great deal. I hope I corrected some of my mistakes, and I learned to speak Farsi, not perfectly, but better. And as a result, the next time that I went back not with a fully formed project, but with an idea. And thanks to colleagues like Reza, who arranged for me to meet Afghan academics in Afghanistan and to present my rough idea, we were able to develop a proposal that was relevant. I was taught what I needed to make that project work. And mostly what I needed was a wholly Afghan team. So having friends, the fixers that foreigners going to Afghanistan rely on a lot, those guides made my life much easier. So having explained how I did better, I want to try and draw some lessons from that experience for you. And I guess the key lesson to come out of that is that you need networks. It's really important for you to know the other Afghans who can help you, who've been here longer, who can help you negotiate these systems. But it's also really useful for you to have people like me, to have British networks who understand really well the systems and can explain them to you. But be careful. British people are not experiencing British systems in the same way that you do. British people who have grown up in the UK take their knowledge for granted. They don't know, what they take for granted. So the wider your networks and the more varied, the better. An academic like me, especially one who didn't grow up in the UK, can't tell you about how to get your kids into school, about how to get on the housing list, because I've never had to do that. But academics like me, especially ones who have made a career from working in Afghanistan, especially academics who have publications, who have profited from our time in Afghanistan, owe you a debt. Call in that debt. Come to us. Ask us for advice. Tell us when we're preparing our next project on Afghans or Afghanistan that we should find a place for you, that we should budget for postdocs and PhDs, that we should help you to prepare your own research projects, because you are the experts in that field. Ask us what you need to do to succeed in academia, both as students and later on when you're looking for work as lecturers, as researchers. Ask us what your CV should look like. And I don't mean just the piece of paper, but what you need on your CV in order to get a job. The publications, what kind of publications, the grants. Start making those applications now. Use us. We owe you a debt, and you need to call it in. In the last 5 minutes, Rabia, if I have it, you can ask me now some of those questions, and I'll be very happy to answer it. And I know that there are others in the room, such as Ceri and Professor Marsden and others, who will be happy to answer. Can we do that for 5 minutes? Okay. Any questions? That's how bad my Farsi is. Please.
Dr. Lisa, thank you very much for the generous offer for giving the chance to ask you and come up for support. My question is, since you're opening that ground for Afghans, to ask you, how about when you or others were in Afghanistan, how you have shared lessons learned with your policymakers here, so that they consider that things are not going well, you should change it. What I mean is, we may not have access to that policymakers, which you have access to that. Have you shared that things from ground reality with your policymakers or not?
Do I need the mic?
It's fine.
Okay.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Fine. Let me repeat the question briefly. Namad was asking, how is it possible to influence policymakers here to share their knowledge with those policymakers and improve their policy? It's a really hard question. I've been working in this field for 30 years. And about 26 years ago, there was a change of government, and we had a new government that promised to introduce evidence-based policymaking. I don't know how my UK colleagues here feel, but there is no such thing. Policy is ideologically driven, and it's really difficult. It's not impossible, but it's really difficult to make your voices heard.
One way you can do it is through pressure groups. And there is, for example, an all-party parliamentary group on Afghanistan, trying to get the ears of those people. But I was at an event organized in Westminster. Bismillah, when was it? Was it November, December? Yeah, it was sometime last winter. And we had people like Baroness Helena Kennedy there. We had quite influential people there. And they were talking about the situation of Hazara. And at the end of the presentations, I asked, that's all very well, but the Home Office is not listening. And I asked Helena Kennedy, will you make the Home Office listen? And she looked at me and she said, we'll do our best, but we can't guarantee anything. So I'm really sorry, that's not a very productive question, but all I can say is keep banging at the door.